Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another fun-filled edition of Chapters Live. As always, I'm Caitlin from the Fletcher branch. As always, I have on my fabulous wizard's hat, and once again, we are back into our reading of Connecticut Yankee and King Arthur's Court by Mark Twain. Now, mainly what we picked up with last time was that our hero, Hank, had finally been sent on a quest despite his great desire not to. And he is accompanied by a young lady named Sandy, who seems to be very empty-headed, although no more so than anybody else in the time period, and also never shuts up. So a lot of the journey is him futzing, just trying not to think about the discomfort of the armor, and also trying to think about stopping the flow of words from her mouth. They do run into a few adventures while they're there. He meets some freemen and muses about how that freemen in this country at this time really aren't free, and that most of the power is being taken up by, the lords and the monarchy, who are the definite minority. He encounters some knights and manages to scare them off with his pipe. And next thing you know, he's got some knights that he's taken prisoner. And finally, when we left off, he had arrived at the court of Morgan Le Fay, who is Arthur's sister and very evil, and had banqueted with her and been able to keep her in line by mentioning that he was the boss, because, as you know, he is quite notorious throughout the entire kingdom. And finally, he had just saved a young man from torture, and a young man and his wife, and had sent them off to the Man Factory, which is where he puts people that he believes to be incredibly exceptional. So, last we left off, we are still in the court of Morgan Le Fay, and that is where we will pick up with Chapter 18, In the Queen's Dungeons. Well, I arranged all that, and I had the man sent to his home. I had a great desire to rack the executioner, not because he was a good, painstaking, and pains-giving official, for surely it was not to his discredit that he performed his functions well, but to pay him back for wantonly cuffing and otherwise distressing the young woman. The priest told me about this, and were generously hot to have him punished. Something of this disagreeable sort was turning up every now and then. I mean, episodes that showed that not all priests were frauds and self-seekers, but that many, even the great majority of these that were down on the ground among the common people, were sincere and right-hearted and devoted to the alleviation of human troubles and sufferings. Well, it was a thing which could not be helped, so I seldom fretted about it, and never many minutes at a time. It has never been my way to bother much about things which you can't cure. But I did not like it, for it was just the sort of thing to keep people reconciled to an established church. We must have a religion, it goes without saying, but my idea is to have it cut up into 40 free sects so that they will police each other, as had been the case in the United States in my time. Concentration of power in a political machine is bad, and an established church is only a political machine. It was invented for that. It is nursed, cradled, preserved for that. It is an enemy to human liberty, and does no good which it could not better do in a split-up and scattered condition. That wasn't law. It wasn't gospel. It was only opinion. My opinion. And I was only a man, one man, so it wasn't worth any more than the Pope's, or any less for that matter. Well, I couldn't rack the executioner, neither would I overlook the just complaint of the priests. The man must be punished somehow or other, so I degraded him from his office and made him leader of the band, the new one that was to be started. He begged hard and said he couldn't play, a plausible excuse, but too thin. There wasn't a musician in the country who could. The Queen was a good deal outraged next morning when she found she was going to have neither Hugo's life nor his property. But I told her she must bear this cross, that while by law and custom she certainly was entitled to both the man's life and his property, there were very extenuating circumstances, and so in Arthur the King's name I had pardoned him. The deer was ravaging the man's fields, and he had killed it in sudden passion, and not for gain, and he had carried it into the royal forest in the hope that might make detection of the misdoer impossible. Confound her, I couldn't make her see that sudden passion is an extenuating circumstance in the killing of venison, or of a person, so I gave it up and let her sulk it out. I did think I was going to have to make her see it by remarking that her own sudden passion, in the case of the page, modified that crime. "Crime?" she exclaimed. "How thou talkest! Crime, forsooth! Oh, man, I'm going to pay for him!" It was no use to waste sense on her. Training is everything. Training is all there is to a person. We speak of nature. It is folly. There's no such thing as nature. What we call by that misleading name is merely heredity and training. We have no thoughts of our own, or no opinions of our own. They are transmitted to us, trained into us. All that is original in us, and therefore fairly creditable or discreditable to us, can be covered up and hidden by the paint of a cambric needle, all the rest being atoms contributed by and inherited from a procession of ancestors that stretches back 1 billion years to the atom clan or grasshopper or monkey from whom our race has been so tediously and ostentatiously and unprofitably developed. And as for me, all that I think about in this plodding, sad pilgrimage, this pathetic drift between the eternities, is to look out and humbly live a pure and high and blameless life, and save that one microscopic atom in me that is truly me. The rest may land in Sheol and welcome for all I care. No, confound her. Her intellect was good. She had brains enough, but her training made her an ass. That is, from a many centuries later point of view. To kill the page was no crime. It was her right, and upon her right she stood, serenely and unconscious of offense. She was a result of generations of training in the unexamined and unassailed belief that the law which permitted her to kill a subject when she chose was a perfectly right and righteous one. Well, we must give even Satan his due. She deserved a compliment for one thing, and I tried to pay it, but the words stuck in my throat. She had a right to kill the boy, but she was in no wise obliged to pay for him. That was law for some other people, but not for her. She knew quite well that she was doing a large and generous thing to pay for that lad, and that I ought, in common fairness, to come out with something handsome about it, but I couldn't. My mouth refused. I couldn't help seeing, in my fancy, that poor old grandam with the broken heart, and that fair young creature lying butchered, his little silken pomps and vanities laced with his golden blood. How could she pay for him? Whom could she pay? And so, well knowing that this woman, trained as she had been, deserved praise, even adulation, was yet not able to utter it, trained as I had been. The best I could do was fish up a compliment from outside, so to speak, and the pity of it was that it was true. Madam, your people will adore you for this. Quite true, but I meant to hang her for it some day if I lived. Some of those laws were too bad, altogether too bad. A master might kill his slave for nothing, for mere spite, malice, or to pass the time, just as we have seen that the crowned head could do it with his slave, that is to say, anybody. A gentleman could kill a free commoner and pay for him, cash or garden truck. A noble could kill a noble without expense, as far as the law was concerned, but reprisals in kind were to be expected. Anybody could kill somebody, except the commoner and the slave. These had no privileges. If they killed, it was murder, and the law would stand murder. It made short work of the experimenter, and of his family, too, if he murdered somebody who belonged up among the ornamental ranks. If a commoner gave a noble even so much as a Damien's scratch, which didn't kill or even hurt, he got Damien's dose for it just the same. They pulled him to rags and tatters with horses, and all the world came to see the show and crack jokes and have a good time. And some of the performances of the best people present were as tough and as properly unprintable as any that have been printed by the pleasant Casanova in his chapter about the dismemberment of Louis XV's poor, awkward enemy. I'd had enough of this grisly place by this time and wanted to leave, but I couldn't because I had something on my mind that my conscience kept prodding me about and wouldn't let me forget. If I had the remaking of man, he wouldn't have any conscience. It is one of the most disagreeable things connected with person, and though it certainly does a great deal of good, it cannot be said to pay in the long run. It would be much better to have less good and more comfort. Still, this is only my opinion, and I'm only one man. Others with less experience may think differently. They have a right to their view. I only stand to this. I've noticed my conscience for many years, and I know it is more trouble and bother to me than anything else I've started with. I suppose that in the beginning I prized it because we prize anything that is ours. Yet how foolish it was to think so. If we look at it in another way, we see how absurd it is. If I had an anvil in me, would I prize it? Of course not. And yet, when you come to think, there is no real difference between a conscience and an anvil. I mean, for comfort. I've noticed it 1,000 times. And you can dissolve an anvil with acids when you couldn't stand it any longer. But there isn't any way that you can work off a conscience. At least so it will stay worked off, not that I know of anyway. There was something I wanted to do before leaving, but it was a disagreeable matter, and I hated to go at it. Well, it bothered me all the morning. I could have mentioned it to the old king, but what would be the use? He was but an extinct volcano. He had been active in his time, but his fire was out this good while. He was only a stately ash pile now, gentle enough and kindly enough for my purpose, without doubt, but not usable. He was nothing, this so-called king. The queen was the only power there, and she was a Vesuvius. As a favor, she might consent to warm a flock of sparrows for you, but then she might take that very opportunity to turn herself loose and bury a city. However, I reflected that as often as any other way, when you are expecting the worst, you get something that is not so bad, after all. So I braced up and placed my matter before Her Royal Highness. I said I'd been having a general jail delivery at Camelot and among neighboring castles, and with her permission I would like to examine her collection, her bric-a-brac, that is to say, her prisoners. She resisted, but I was expecting that. But she finally consented. I was expecting that too, but not so soon. That about ended my discomfort. She called her guards and torches, and we went down into the dungeons. These were down under the castle's foundations, and mainly were small cells hollowed out of the living rock. Some of these cells had no light at all. In one of them was a woman, in foul rags, who sat on the ground and would not answer a question, or speak a word, but only looked up at us once or twice through a cobweb of tangled hair, as if to see what casual thing it might be that was disturbing with sound and light the meaningless dull dream that was become her life. After that she sat bowed, with her dirt-caked fingers idly interlocked in her lap, and gave no further sign. This poor rack of bones was a woman of middle age, apparently, but only apparently. She had been there 9 years and was 18 when she entered. She was a commoner, had been sent here on her bridal night by Sir Bruce Sans-Pite, a neighboring lord whose vassal her father was, and to which said lord she had refused what has since been called les droits du seigneur, and moreover had opposed violence to violence and spilt half a gill of his almost sacred blood. The young husband had interfered at that point, believing the bride's life in danger, and had flung the noble out into the midst of the humble and trembling wedding guests in the parlor, and left him there astonished at this strange treatment, and implacably embittered against both bride and groom. The said lord, being cramped for dungeon room, had asked the queen to accommodate his two criminals, and here in her Bastille they had been ever since. Hither, indeed, they had come before their crime was an hour old, and had never seen each other since. Here they were, kerneled like toads in the same rock. They had passed 9 pitch-dark years within 50 feet of each other, yet neither knew whether the other was alive or not. All the first years their only question had been, asked with beseechings and tears that might have moved stones in time perhaps, but hearts are not stones. Is he alive? Is she alive? But they had never got an answer, and at last that question was not asked any more, or any other. I wanted to see the man after hearing all this. He was 34 years old and looked 60. He sat upon a square block of stone with his head bent down, his forearms resting on his knees, his long hair hanging like a fringe before his face, and he was muttering to himself. He raised his chin and looked at us slowly over in a listless, dull way, blinking with the distress of the torchlight. Then dropped his head and fell to muttering again, and took no further notice of us. There were some pathetically suggestive dumb witnesses present. On his wrists and ankles were cicatrices, old smooth scars, and fastened onto the stone on which he sat was a chain with manacles and fetters attached. But this apparatus lay idle on the ground and was thick with rust. Chains cease to be needed after the spirit has gone out of a man. I could not rouse the man, so I said we would take him to her and see, to the bride who was the fairest thing in the earth to him once, roses and pearls and dew made flesh, for him a wonder-work, the masterwork of nature, with eyes like no other eyes, and voice like no other voice, and a freshness and lithe young grace, and beauty that belonged properly to the creatures of dreams, as he thought, and to no other. The sight of her would set his stagnant blood leaping, the sight of her. But it was a disappointment. They sat together on the ground and looked dimly wondering into each other's faces a while, with a sort of weak animal curiosity, then forgot each other's presence and dropped their eyes, and you saw that they were away again, and wandering in some far land of dreams and shadows that we know nothing about. I had them taken out and sent to their friends. The queen did not like it much. Not that she felt any personal interest in the matter, but she thought it disrespectful to Sir Bruce Sans-Pite. However, I assured her that if he found he couldn't stand it, I would fix him so he could. I set 47 prisoners loose out of those awful rat holes, and left only one in captivity. He was a lord, and had killed another lord, a sort of kinsman to the queen. That other lord had ambushed him to assassinate him, but this fellow had got the best of him and cut his throat. However, it was not for that I left him jailed, but for maliciously destroying the only public well in one of his wretched villages. The queen was bound to hang him for killing her kinsman, but I would not allow it. It was no crime to kill an assassin. But I said I was willing to let her hang him for destroying the well, so she concluded to put up with that, as it was better than nothing. Dear me, for what trifling offences the most of those 47 men and women were shut up there. Indeed, some were then there for no distinct offence at all, but only to gratify someone's spite, and not always the queen's by any means, but a friend's. The newest prisoner's crime was a mere remark which he had made. He said he believed that all men were about alike, and one man as good as another, barring clothes. He said he believed that if you were to strip the nation naked and send a stranger through the crowd, he couldn't tell the king from a quack doctor nor a duke from a hotel clerk. Apparently here was a man whose brains had not been reduced to an ineffectual mush by idiotic training. I set him loose and sent him to the factory. Some of the cells carved into the living rock were just behind the face of the precipice, and in each of these an arrow slit had been pierced outward to the daylight, and so the captive had a thin ray from the blessed sun for his comfort. The case of one of these poor fellows was particularly hard. From his dusty swallow's hole high up in that vast wall of native rock, he could peer out through the arrow slit and see his own home off yonder in the valley, and for 22 years he had watched it with heartache and longing through that crack. He could see the light shine there at night, and in the daytime he could see figures go in and come out, his wife and children, some of them no doubt, though he could not make out at that distance. In the course of years he noted festivities there and tried to rejoice, and wondered if they were funerals or what they might be, and he noted if they were weddings and what they might be, and he noted funerals, and they wrung his heart. He could make out the coffin, but he could not determine its size, and so could not tell whether it was his wife or a child. He could see the procession form, with priests and mourners, and move solemnly away, bearing the secret with him. He had left behind him 5 children and a wife, and in 19 years he had seen 5 funerals issue, and none of them humble enough in pomp to denote a servant. So he had lost 5 of his treasures. There must still be one remaining, one now infinitely, unspeakably precious. But which one? Wife or child? That was the question which tortured him, by night and by day, asleep and awake. Well, to have an interest of some sort in half a ray of light when you are in a dungeon is a great support to the body and preserver of the intellect. This man was in pretty good condition yet. By the time he had finished telling me his distressful tale, I was in the same state of mind that you would have been in yourself, if you've got average human curiosity. That is to say, I was as burning up as he was to find out which member of the family it was that was left. So I took him over home myself, and an amazing kind of surprise party it was, too. Typhoons and cyclones of frantic joy and whole Niagaras of happy tears, and by George, we found the aforetime young matron graying toward the imminent verge of her half-century, and the babies all men and women, and some of them married and experimenting family-wise themselves, for not a soul of the tribe was dead. Conceive of the ingenious devilishness of that queen. She had a special hatred for this prisoner, and she had invented all those funerals herself to scorch his heart with. And the sublimest stroke of genius of the whole thing was leaving the family invoice a funeral short, so as to let him wear his poor old soul out guessing. But for me, he never would have got out. Morgan Le Fay hated him with her whole heart, and she never would have softened toward him. And yet his crime was committed more in thoughtlessness than deliberate depravity. He had said she had red hair. Well, she had, but that was no way to speak of it. When red-headed people are above a certain social grade, their hair is auburn. Consider it, among these 47 captives, there were 5 whose names, offenses, and dates of incarceration were no longer known. 1 woman and 4 men, all bent and wrinkled and mind-extinguished patriarchs. They themselves had long ago forgotten these tales. At any rate, they had mere vague theories about them, nothing definite, and nothing that they repeated twice in the same way. The succession of priests whose office it had been to pray daily with the captives and remind them that God had put them there for some wise purpose or other, and teach them that patience, humbleness, and submission to oppression was what he loved to see in parties of a subordinate rank, had traditions about these poor old human ruins, but nothing more. These traditions went but little way, for they concerned the length of the incarceration only, and not the names of the offenses. And even by the help of tradition, the only thing that could be proven was that none of the five had seen daylight for 35 years. How much longer this privation had lasted was not guessable. The king and queen knew nothing about these poor creatures except that they were heirlooms, assets inherited, along with the throne from the former firm. Nothing of their history had been transmitted with their persons, and so the inheriting owners had considered them of no value, and had felt no interest in them. I said to the queen, "Then why in the world didn't you set them free?" The question was a puzzler. She didn't know why she hadn't. The thing had never come up in her mind. So here she was, forecasting the veritable history of future prisoners of the Castle d'If without knowing it. It seemed plain to me now that with her training, those inherited prisoners were merely property. Nothing more, nothing less. Well, when we inherit property, it does not occur to us to throw it away, even when we do not value it. When I brought my procession of human bats up into the open world, and the glare of the afternoon sun previously blindfolding them, in charity for eyes so long untortured by light, they were a spectacle to look at. Skeletons, scarecrows, goblins, pathetic frights, every one. Legitimatest possible children of monarchy by the grace of God and the established church. I muttered absently, "I wish I could photograph them." You have seen that kind of people who will never let on that they don't know the meaning of a new big word. The more ignorant they are, the more pitifully certain they are to pretend you haven't shot over their heads. The queen was just one of that sort, and was always making the stupidest blunders by reason of it. She hesitated a moment, then her face brightened up with sudden comprehension, and she said she would do it for me. I thought to myself, she? How could she know about photography? But it was a poor time to be thinking. When I looked around, she was moving on the procession with an axe. Well, she certainly was a curious one, was Morgan Le Fay. I have seen a good many kinds of women in my time, but she laid over them all for variety. And how sharply characteristic of her this episode was. She had no more idea than a horse of how to photograph a procession, but being in doubt, it was just like her to try to do it with an axe. Chapter 19. Night Errantry as a Trade. Sandy and I were on the road again next morning, bright and early. It was so good to open up one's lungs and take in whole, luscious barrowfuls of the blessed God's untainted, dew-freshened, woodland-scented air once more, after suffocating body and mind for 2 days and nights in the moral and physical stenches of that intolerable old buzzard roost. I mean for me. Of course, the place was all right and agreeable enough for Sandy, for she had been used to high life all her days. Poor girl, her jaws had had a wearisome rest now for a while, and I was expected to get the consequences. I was right, but she had stood by me most helpfully in the castle, and had mightily supported and reinforced me with gigantic foolishnesses, which were worth more for the occasion than wisdoms double their size. So I thought she had earned a right to work her mill for a while, if she wanted to, and I felt not a pang when she started it up. "Now turn we unto Sir Marhaus, that rode with the damsel of 30 winter of age southward. Are you going to see if you can work up another half-stretch on the trail of the cowboys, Sandy?" "Even so, fair, my lord." "Go ahead, then. I won't interrupt this time if I can help it. Begin over again, start fair, and shake out all your reefs, and I will load my pipe and give good attention. Now turn we unto Sir Marhaus, that rode with the damsel of 30 winter of age southward. And so they came into a deep forest, and by fortune they were nighted, and rode along in a deep way, and at the last they came into a courtelage where abode the Duke of South Marches, and there they asked harbour. And on the morn the Duke sent unto Sir Marhaus, and bade him make ready. And so Sir Marhaus arose and armed him, and there was a mass sung afore him, and he brake his fast, and so mounted on horseback in the court of the castle, there they should do the battle. And so was the Duke already on horseback, clean armed, and his 6 sons by him, and every each had a spear in his hand, and so they encountered, whereas the Duke and his 2 sons brake their spears upon him. But Sir Marhaus held up his spear, and touched none of them. Then came the 4 sons by couples, and 2 of them brake their spears, and so did the other 2. And all this while Sir Marhaus touched them not. Then Sir Marhaus ran to the Duke, and smote him there with his spear, that horse and man fell to the earth. And so he served his sons. And then Sir Marhaus let down, and bade the Duke yield him, or else he would slay him. And then some of his sons recovered, and would have set upon Sir Marhaus. And then Sir Marhaus said to the Duke, Cease thy sons, or else I will do the uttermost to you all. When the Duke saw he might not escape the death, he cried to his sons, and charged them to yield them to Sir Marhaus. And they kneeled all down, and put the pommels of their swords to the knight, and so he received them. And then they holp up their father, and so by their common assent promised unto Sir Marhaus never to be foes unto Sir Arthur, and thereupon at Whitsuntide after to come he and his sons, and put them in the king's grace. Even so standeth the history, fair Sir Boss. Now ye shall wit that that very Duke and his 6 sons are they, whom but few days past you also did overcome and said to Arthur's court. Why, Sandy, you can't mean it. And I speak not sooth, that it be the worse for me. Well, 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 now who would ever have thunk it? 1 whole Duke and 6 dukelets. Why, Sandy, it was an elegant haul. Knight-errantry is most chuckle-headed trade, and it is tedious hard work, too. But I begin to see that there is money in it, after all, if you have luck. Not that I would ever engage in it as a business, for I wouldn't. No sound and legitimate business can be established on a basis of speculation. A successful world of the knight-errantry line. Now, what is it when you blow away the nonsense and come down to the cold facts? It's just a corner in pork, that's all, and you can't make anything else out of it. You're rich, yes, suddenly rich, for about a day, maybe a week, then somebody corners the market on you, and down goes your bucket chop. Ain't that so, Sandy? Whithersoever it be that my mind miscarrieth, betraying simple language in such sort that the words do seem to continue endlong and overthwart, there's no use beating about the bush and trying to get around it that way, Sandy. It's so. Just as I say, I know it's so. And moreover, when you come right down to the bedrock, knight-errantry is worse than pork. For whatever happens, the pork's left, and so somebody's benefited anyway. But when the market breaks in a knight-errantry whirl, and every knight in the pool passes in his checks, what have you got for assets? Just a rubbish pile of battered corpses and a barrel or 2 of busted hardware. Can you call those assets? Give me pork, every time, am I right? Ah, peradventure, my head being distraught by the manifold matters whereunto the confusions of these but late adventured haps, and fortunings whereby not I alone, nor you alone, but every each of us, me seemeth. No, it's not your head, Sandy. Your head's all right, as far as it goes, but you've no business. That's where the trouble is. It unfits you to argue about business, and you're wrong to be always trying. However, that aside, it was a good haul anyway, and will breed a handsome crop of reputation in Arthur's court. And speaking of the cowboys, what a curious country this is for men, women and men who never get old. Now, there's Morgan le Fay, as fresh and young as a Vassar pullet, to all appearances, and here's this old Duke of the South Marches still slashing away with sword and lance at his time of life, after raising such a family as he has raised. As I understand it, Sir Gawain killed 7 of his sons, and yet he still had 6 left for Sir Marhaus and me to take into camp. And then there was that damsel of 60 winter of age still excursioning around in her frosty bloom. How old are you, Sandy? It was the first time I ever struck a still place in her. The mill had shut down for repairs, or something. Chapter 20. The Ogre's Castle. Between 6 and 9 we made 10 miles, which was plenty for a horse carrying triple, man, woman, and armor. Then we stopped for a long nooning under some trees by a limpid brook. Right so came by and by a knight riding, and as he drew near he made dolorous moan, and by the words of it I perceived that he was cursing and swearing. Yet, nevertheless, was I glad of his coming, for that I saw he bore a bulletin board, whereon in letters all of shining gold was writ, Use Peterson's prophylactic toothbrush, all the go. I was glad of his coming, for even by this token I knew him for knight of mine. It was Sir Madok de la Montaigne, a burly great fellow whose chief distinction was that he had come within an ace of sending Sir Lancelot down over his horsetail once. He was never long in a stranger's presence without finding some pretext or other to let out that great fact. But there was another fact of nearly the same size, which he never pushed upon anybody unasked, and yet never withheld when asked. That was, that the reason he didn't quite succeed was that he was interrupted and sent down over horsetail himself. This innocent vast lubber did not see any particular difference between the 2 facts. I liked him, for he was earnest in his work and very valuable. He was so fine to look at, with his broad mailed shoulders and the grand leaning set of his plumed head, and his big shield with its quaint device of a gauntleted hand clutching a prophylactic toothbrush, with motto, "Try Nui, no you don't." This was a toothwash that I was introducing. He was aweary, he said, and indeed he looked it, but he would not alight. He said he was after the stove polish man, and with this he broke out cursing and swearing anew. The bulletin boarder referred to was Sir Osasi of Surluce, a brave knight, and of considerable celebrity on account of his having tried conclusions in a tournament once, with no less a mogul than Sir Gaheris himself, though not successfully. He was of a light and laughing disposition, and to him nothing in this world was serious. It was for this reason that I had chosen him to work up a stove polish sentiment. There were no stoves yet, and so there could be nothing serious about stove polish. All that the agent needed to do was to deftly and by degrees prepare the public for the great change, and have them established in predilections toward neatness against the time when the stove should appear upon the stage. Sir Maddock was very bitter, and brake out anew with cursings. He said he had cursed his soul to rags, and yet he would not get down from his horse, neither would he take any rest, or listen to any comfort until he should have found Sir Ossace, and settled this account. It appeared, by what I could piece together of the unprofane fragments of his statement, that he had chanced upon Sir Ossace at dawn of the morning, and been told that if he would make a short cut across the fields and swamps and broken hills and glades, he could head up a company of travelers who would be rare customers for prophylaxis and toothwash. With characteristic zeal, Sir Maddock had plunged away at once upon this quest, and after 3 hours of awful cross-lot riding had overhauled his game. And behold, it was the 5 patriarchs that had been released from the dungeons the evening before. Poor old creatures! It was all of 20 years since any one of them had known what it was to be equipped with any remaining snag or remnant of a tooth. "Blank, blank, blank him," said Sir Maddock, "and I do not stove polish him, and I may find him leave him to me, for never no knight that hight Ossace, or aught else may deign me do me this disservice and bide on leave, and I may find him, the which I have thereunto sworn a great oath this day." And with these words, and others, he lightly took a spear and gat him thence. In the middle of the afternoon we came upon one of these very patriarchs ourselves, in the edge of a poor village. He was basking in the love of relatives and friends whom he had not seen for 50 years, and about him and caressing him were also descendants of his own body, whom he had never seen at all till now. But to him these were all strangers. His memory was gone, his mind was stagnant. It seemed incredible that a man could outlast half a century shut up in a dark hole like a rat, but here were his old wife and some old comrades to testify to it. They could remember him as he was in the freshness and strength of his young manhood, when he kissed his child and delivered it to its mother's hands and went away into that long oblivion. The people of the castle could not tell within half a generation the length of time the man had been shut up in there for his unrecorded and forgotten offense. But this old wife knew, and so did her old child, who stood there among her married sons and daughters, trying to realize a father who had been to her a name, a thought, a formless image, a tradition all her life, and now was suddenly converted into actual flesh and blood and set before her face. It was a curious situation, yet it is not on that account that I have made room for it here, but on account of a thing which seemed to me still more curious. To wit, that this dreadful matter brought from these downtrodden people no outburst of rage against their oppressors. They had been heritors and subjects of cruelty and outrage so long that nothing could have startled them but a kindness. Yet here was a curious revelation, indeed, of the depth to which these people had been sunk in slavery. Their entire being was reduced to a monotonous, dead level of patience, resignation, dumb, uncomplaining acceptance of whatever might befall them in this life. Their very imagination was dead. You can say that of a man. He has struck bottom, I reckon. There is no lower deep for him. I rather wished I had gone some other road. This was not the sort of experience for a statesman to encounter who was planning out a peaceful revolution in his mind. For it cannot help bringing up the unget-aroundable fact that, all gentle cant and philosophizing to the contrary notwithstanding, no people in the world ever did achieve their freedom by goody-goody talk and moral suasion, it being immutable law that all revolutions that will succeed must begin in blood, whatever may answer afterward. If history teaches anything, it teaches that. What this folk needed then was a reign of terror and a guillotine, and I was the wrong man for them. 2 days later, toward noon, Sandy began to show signs of excitement and feverish expectancy. She said we were approaching the ogre's castle. I was surprised into an uncomfortable shock. The object of our quest had gradually dropped out of my mind. The sudden resurrection of it made it seem quite a real and startling thing, for a moment, and roused up in me a smart interest. Sandy's excitement increased every moment, and so did mine, for that sort of thing is catching. My heart got to thumping. You can't reason with your heart. It has its own laws, and thumps about things which the intellect scorns. Presently, when Sandy slid from the horse, motioned me to stop, and went creeping stealthily with her head bent nearly to her knees, toward a row of bushes that bordered a declivity, the thumpings grew stronger and quicker, and they kept it up while she was gaining her ambush and getting her glimpse over the declivity, and also while I was creeping to her side on my knees. Her eyes were burning now. She pointed with her finger and said in a panting whisper, the castle, lo, where it looms. What a welcome disappointment I experienced. I said, castle? That's nothing but a pigsty. A pigsty with a wattled fence around it. She looked surprised and distressed. The animation faded out of her face, and during many moments she was lost in thought, and silent. Then, it was not enchanted aforetime, she said in a musing fashion, as if to herself. And how strange is this marvel, and how awful, that to the very one perception it is enchanted, and dight in a base and shameful aspect, yet to the perception of the other it is not enchanted, hath suffered no change, but stands firm and stately still, girt with its moat, and waving its banners in the blue air from its towers. And God shield us, how it pricks the heart to see again these gracious captives, and the sorrow deepened in their sweet faces. We have tarried long, and are to blame. I saw my cue. The castle was enchanted to me, not to her. It would have wasted time to try and argue her out of her delusion. It couldn't be done. I must just humor it. So I said, this is a common case, the enchanting of a thing to one eye and leaving it in its proper form to another. You have heard of it before, Sandy, though you haven't happened to experience it. But no harm is done. In fact, it is lucky the way it is. These ladies were hogs to everybody, and to themselves it would be necessary to break the enchantment, and that might be impossible if one failed to find out the particular process of the enchantment. It hazardous, too, for in attempting a disenchantment without the true key, you are liable to err and turn your hogs into dogs, and the dogs into cats, the cats into rats, and so on, and end by reducing your materials to nothing, finally, or to an odorless gas, which you can't follow, which of course amounts to the same thing. But here, by good luck, no one's eyes but mine are under the enchantment, and so it is of no consequence to dissolve it. These ladies remain ladies to you, and to themselves, and to everyone else, and at the same time they will suffer in no way from my delusion, for when I know that an ostensible hog is a lady, that is enough for me. I know how to treat her. Thanks, O sweet my lord, thou talkest like an angel, and I know that thou wilt deliver them, for that thou art minded to great deeds, and art as strong a knight of your hands, and as brave to will and to do, as any that is on leave. I will not leave a princess in the sty, Sandy. Are those three yonder that to my disordered eyes are starveling swineherds? The ogres? Are they changed also? Oh, it is most wonderful. Now am I fearful? For how canst thou strike with sure aim when 5 of their 9 cubits of stature are to thee invisible? Oh, go warily, fair sir, this is a mightier emprise than I wend. You be easy, Sandy. All I need to know is how much of an ogre is invisible, then I know how to locate his vitals. Don't you be afraid. I will make short work of those bunco steerers. Stay where you are. I left Sandy kneeling there, corpse-faced but plucky and hopeful, and rode down to the pigsty and struck up a trade with the swineherds. I won their gratitude by buying out all the hogs at the lump sum of 16 pennies, which was rather above latest quotations. I was just in time, for the church, the lord of the manor, and the rest of the tax-gatherers would have been along next day and swept off pretty much all of the stock, leaving the swineherds very short of hogs and Sandy out of princesses. But now the tax people could be paid in cash, and there would be a stake left besides. One of the men had 10 children, and he said that last year when a priest came and of his 10 pigs took the fattest one for tithes, the wife burst out upon him and offered him a child and said, Thou beast without bowels of mercy, why leave me my child, yet rob me of the wherewithal to feed it? How curious. The same thing had happened in the Wales of my day under the same old established church, which was supposed by many to have changed its nature when it changed its disguise. I sent the 3 men away, and then opened the sty gate and beckoned Sandy to come, which she did, and not leisurely, but with the rush of a prairie fire. And when I saw her fling herself upon those hogs with tears of joy running down her cheeks, and strain them to her heart, and kiss them, and caress them, and call them all reverently by grand princely names, I was ashamed of her, ashamed of the human race. We had to drive those hogs home, 10 miles, and no ladies were ever more fickle-minded or contrary. They would stay on no road, no path. They broke out through the brush on all sides and flowed away in all directions over rocks and hills and the roughest places they could find, and they must not be struck or roughly accosted. Sandy could not bear to see them treated in ways unbecoming their rank. The troublesomest old sow of the lot had to be called my lady and your highness like the rest. It is annoying and difficult to scour around after hogs in armor. There was one small countess with an iron ring in her snout and hardly any hair on her back that was the devil for perversity. She gave me a race of an hour over all sorts of country, and then we were right where we had started from, having not made a rod of real progress. I seized her at last by the tail and brought her along, squealing. When I overtook Sandy, she was horrified and said it was in the last degree indelicate to drag a countess by her train. We got the hogs home just at dark, most of them. The princesses Nurovens de Morganore was missing, and two of her ladies-in-waiting, namely Miss Angela Bohan and the demoiselle Elaine Cotemans. The former of these two being a young black sow with a white star on her forehead, and the latter a brown one with thin legs and a slight limp in the forward shank on the starboard side. A couple of the tryingest blisters to drive that I ever saw. Also among the missing were several more baronesses, and I wanted them to stay missing, but no, all of that sausage meat had to be found, so servants were sent out with torches to scour the woods and hills to that end. Of course, the whole drove was housed in the house, and great guns. Well, I never saw anything like it, never heard anything like it, never smelt anything like it. It was like an insurrection in a gasometer. Chapter 21. The Pilgrims. When I did get to bed at last, I was unspeakably tired. The stretching out and the relaxing of the long, tense muscles, how luxurious, how delicious. But that was as far as I could get. Sleep was out of the question for the present. The ripping and tearing and squealing of the nobility up and down the halls and corridors was pandemonium come again, and kept me broad awake. Being awake, my thoughts were busy, of course, and mainly they busied themselves with Sandy's curious delusion. Here she was, as sane a person as the kingdom could produce, and yet, from my point of view, she was acting like a crazy woman. My land, the power of training, of influence, of education, can bring a body up to believe anything. I had to put myself in Sandy's place to realize that she was not a lunatic. Yes, and to put her in mind to demonstrate how easy it is to seem a lunatic to a person who's not been taught as you has been taught. If I told Sandy I had seen a wagon, uninfluenced by enchantment, spin along 50 miles an hour, had seen a man, unequipped with magic powers, get into a basket and soar out of sight among the clouds, and had listened, without any necromancer's help, to the conversation of a person who was several hundred miles away, Sandy would not merely have supposed me to be crazy. She would have thought she knew it. Everybody around her believed in enchantments. Nobody had any doubts. To doubt that a castle could be turned into a sty and its occupants into hogs would have been the same as my doubting, among Connecticut people, the actuality of the telephone and its wonders, and in both cases will be absolute proof of a diseased mind, an unsettled reason. Yes, Sandy was sane, that must be admitted. If I also would be sane, to Sandy, I must keep my superstitions about unenchanted and unmiraculous locomotives, balloons, and telephones to myself. Also, I believed that the world was not flat, and hadn't pillars under it to support it, nor a canopy over it to turn off a universe of water that occupied all space above. But as I was the only person in the kingdom afflicted with such impious and criminal opinions, I recognized that it would be good wisdom to keep quiet about this matter too, if I did not wish to be suddenly shunned and forsaken by everybody as a madman. The next morning, Sandy assembled the swine in the dining room and gave them their breakfast, waiting upon them personally and manifesting in every way the deep reverence which the natives of her island, ancient and modern, have always felt for rank, let its outward casket and mental and moral contents be what they may. I could have eaten with the hogs if I had had birth approaching my lofty official rank, but I hadn't, and so accepted the unavoidable slight and made no complaint. Sandy and I had our breakfast at the second table. The family were not at home. I said, "How many are in the family, Sandy, and where do they keep themselves?" "Family?" Yes. Which family, my good lord? Why, this family, your own family. Sooth to say, I understand you not. I have no family. No family? Why, Sandy, isn't this your home? Now, how indeed might that be? I have no home. Well, then, whose house is this? I'll wit you well I would to you, and I knew myself. Come, you don't even know these people. Then who invited us here? Well, none invited us. We but came, that is all. Why, woman, this is an extraordinary performance. The effrontery of it is beyond admiration. We blandly march into a man's house and cram it full of the only really valuable nobility the sun has yet discovered in the earth, and then it turns out that we don't even know the man's name? How did you ever venture to take this extravagant liberty? I suppose, of course, it was your home. What will the man say? What will he say? Forsooth, what can he say but give thanks? Thanks for what? Her face was filled with a puzzled surprise. Verily, thou troublest mine understanding with strange words. Do you dream that one of his estate is like to have the honour twice in his life to entertain company such as we have brought to grace his house withal? Well, no, when you come to that, no, it's an even bet that this is the first time he's had a treat like this. Then let him be thankful and manifest the same by grateful speech and due humility. He were a dog else, and the heir and engenderer of dogs. To my mind, the situation was uncomfortable. It might become more so. It might be a good idea to muster the hogs and move on. So I said, the day is wasting, Sandy. It's time to get the nobility together and be moving. Wherefore, fair sir and boss? We want to take them to their home, don't we? La, but list to him, they be of all the regions of the earth. Each must hie to her own home. When we might do all these journeys in one so brief life, as he hath appointed that created life, and thereto death likewise with help of Adam, who by sin done through persuasion of his helpmeet, she being wrought upon and betrayed by the beguilements of the great enemy of man, that serpent hight Satan, aforetime consecrated and sent apart unto that evil work, by overmastering spite and envy begotten in his heart, through fell admissions that did blight and mildew and nature erst so white and pure, whence it hove with the shining multitudes, its brethren born in glade and shade of that fair heaven, wherein all such as native be to that rich estate and great Scott. My lord? Well, we haven't got time for this sort of thing. Don't you see we could distribute these people around the earth in less time than it is going to take you to explain that we can't? We mustn't talk now, we must act. You want to be careful. You mustn't let your mill get the start of you that way at a time like this. To business now, and sharp's the word. Who is to take the aristocracy home? Even their friends. These will come for them from the far parts of the earth. This was lightning from a clear sky, for unexpectedness, and the relief of it was like pardon to a prisoner. She would remain to deliver the goods, of course. Well then, Sandy, as our enterprise is handsomely and successfully ended, I will go home and report, and if ever another one, I also am ready. I will go with thee. This was recalling the pardon. How? You'll go with me. Well, why should you? Will I be traitor to my knight, dost think? That were dishonour. I may not part from thee till a knightly encounter in the field some overmatching champion shall fairly win and fairly wear me. I were to blame, and I thought that might ever hap. Let it for the long term, I sighed to myself. I may as well make the best of it. So then I spoke up and said, all right, let's make a start. When she was gone to cry her farewells over the pork, I gave that whole peerage away to the servants, and I asked them to take a duster and dust around a little where the nobilities had mainly lodged and promenaded, but they considered that would be hardly worthwhile, and would moreover be a rather grave departure from custom, and therefore likely to make talk. Departure from custom, that settled it. It was a nation capable of committing any crime but that. The servants said they would follow the fashion, a fashion grown sacred through immemorial observance. They would scatter fresh rushes in all the rooms and halls, and then the evidence of the aristocratic visitation would be no longer visible. It was a kind of satire on nature. It was the scientific method, the geologic method. It deposited the history of the family in a stratified record, and the antiquary could dig through it and tell by the remains of each period what changes of diet the family had introduced successfully for 100 years. The first thing we struck that day was a procession of pilgrims. It was not going our way, but we joined it nevertheless, for it was hourly being borne in upon me, now that if I would govern this country wisely, it must be posted in the details of its life, and not at second hand, but by personal observation and scrutiny. This company of pilgrims resembled Chaucer's in this, that it had in it a sample of about all the upper occupations and professions the country would show, and a corresponding variety of costume. There were young men and old men, young women and old women, lively folk and grave folk. They rode upon mules and horses, and there was not a side saddle in the party, for this specialty was to remain unknown in England for 900 years yet. It was a pleasant, friendly, sociable herd, pious, happy, merry, and full of unconscious coarseness and innocent indecencies. What they regarded as the merry tale went the continual round and caused no more embarrassment than it would have caused in the best English society 12 centuries later. Practical jokes, worthy of the English wits of the first quarter of the far-off 19th century, were sprung here and there and yonder along the line, and compelled the delightedest applause, and sometimes when a bright remark was made at one end of the procession, and started on its travels toward the other, you could note its progress all the way by the sparkling spray of laughter it threw off from its bows as it plowed along, and also by the blushes of the mules in its wake. Sandy knew the goal and purpose of this pilgrimage, and she posted me. She said, "They journey to the Valley of Holiness, for to be blessed of the godly hermits and drink of the miraculous waters and be cleansed from sin." Where is this watering place? It lieth a 2-day journey hence by the borders of the land that hight the Cuckoo Kingdom. Tell me about it. Is it a celebrated place? Oh, of a truth, yes. There be none more so. Of old time there lived there an abbot and his monks. Belike were none in the world more holy than these, for they gave themselves to study of pious books, and spoke not the other one to the other, or indeed to any, and ate decayed herbs and naught thereto, and slept hard, and prayed much, and washed never. Also they wore the same garment till it fell from their bodies through age and decay. Right so came they be to known to all the world by reason of these holy austerities, and visited by rich and poor and reverenced. Proceed. But always there was lack of water there. Whereas upon a time the holy abbot prayed, and for answer a great stream of clear water burst forth by miracle in a desert place. Now were the fickle months tempted of the fiend, and they wrought with their abbot unceasingly by beggings and beseechings that he would construct a bath. And when he was become weary and might not resist more, he said, "Have ye your will then?" and granted that they asked. Now mark thou what 'tis to forsake the ways of purity, the which he loveth, and wanton with such as to be worldly and an offence. These monks did enter into that bath, and come thence washed as white as snow, and lo, in that moment his sign appeared, in miraculous rebuke, for his insulted waters ceased to flow, and utterly vanished away. They fared mildly, Sandy, considering how that kind of crime is regarded in this country. Belike, but it was their first sin, and they had been of perfect life for long, and differing in naught from the angels. Prayers, tears, torturings of the flesh, all was vain to beguile that water to flow again. Even processions, even burnt offerings, even votive candles to the Virgin, did fail every each of them, and all in the land did marvel. How far to find that even this industry has its financial panics, and at times sees its acidnacks and greenbacks languish to zero, and everything come to a standstill. Go on, Sandy. And so, upon a time, after year and day, the good abbot made humble surrender, and destroyed the bath. And behold, his anger was in that moment appeased, and the waters gushed richly forth again, and even unto this day they have not ceased to flow in that generous nature. Then, I take it, nobody has washed since. He that would assay it would have his halter free, yea, and swiftly would he need it too. The community has prospered since. Even from that very day, the fame of the miracle went abroad into all lands. From every land came monks to join. They came even as the fishes come, in shoals in the monastery added building to building, and yet others to these, and so spread wide its arms and took them in. And nuns came also, and more again, and yet more, and built over against the monastery on the yon side of the vale, and added building to building, until mighty was that nunnery. And these were friendly unto those, and they joined their loving labours together, and together they built a fair great foundling asylum midway of the valley between. You spoke of some hermits, Sandy. These have gathered there from the ends of the earth. A hermit thriveth best when there be multitudes of pilgrims. You shall not find no hermit of no sort wanting. If any shall mention a hermit of a kind he thinketh new, and not to be found but in some far strange land, yet him but scratch among the holes and caves and swamps that line that valley of holiness. And whatever be his breed, it skills not. He shall find a sample of it there. I closed up alongside of a burly fellow with a fat, good-humored face, proposing to make myself agreeable and pick up some further crumbs of fact. But I had hardly more than scraped acquaintance with him than he began eagerly and awkwardly to lead up, in the immemorial way, to that same old anecdote, the one Sir Dynadin told me, what time I got into trouble with Sir Sagramore, and was challenged of him on account of it. I excused myself and dropped to the rear of the procession, sad at heart, willing to go hence from this broken life, this vale of tears, this brief day of broken rest, of cloud and storm, of weary struggle and monotonous defeat, yet shrinking from the change, as remembering how long eternity is, and how many have wended thither that know that anecdote. Early in the afternoon we overtook another procession of pilgrims, but in this one was no merriment, no jokes, no laughter, no playful ways, nor any happy giddiness, whether of youth or age. Yet both were here, both age and youth, gray old men and women, strong men and women of middle age, young husbands, young wives, little boys and girls, and 3 babies at the breast. Even the children were smileless. There was not a face among all these 100 people but was cast down, and bore that set expression of hopelessness which is bred of long and hard trials, and old acquaintance with despair. They were slaves. Chains led from their fettered feet and their manacled hands to a sole leather belt about their waists, and all except the children were also linked together in a file, 6 feet apart, by a single chain which led from collar to collar all down the line. They were on foot and had tramped 300 miles in 18 days, upon the cheapest odds and ends of food and stingy rations of that. They had slept in these chains every night, bundled together like swine. They had upon their bodies some poor rags, but they cannot be said to be clothed. Their irons had chafed the skin from their ankles and made sores which were ulcerated and wormy. Their naked feet were torn, and none walked without a limp. Originally there had been 100 of these unfortunates, but about half had been sold on the trip. The trader in charge of them rode a horse and carried a whip with a short handle and a long, heavy lash divided into several knotted tails at the end. With this whip he cut the shoulders of any that tottered from weariness and pain, and straightened them up. He did not speak. The whip conveyed his desire without that. None of these poor creatures looked up as we rode along by. They showed no consciousness of our presence, and they made no sound but one, that was the dull and awful clank of their chains from end to end of the long file, as 43 burdened feet rose and fell in unison. The file moved in a cloud of its own making. All these faces were gray with a coating of dust. One has seen the like of this coating upon furniture in unoccupied houses, and has written his idle thought on it with his finger. I was reminded of this when I noticed the faces of some of those women, young mothers, carrying babes that were near to death and freedom, how as something in their hearts was written in the dust upon their faces, plain to see, and Lord, how plain to read, for it was the track of tears. One of these young mothers was but a girl, and it hurt me to the heart to read that writing and to reflect that it was come out of the breast of such a child, a breast that ought not to know trouble yet, but only the gladness of the morning of life, and no doubt she reeled just then, giddy with fatigue, and down came the lash and flicked a flake of skin from her naked shoulder. It stung me as if I had been hit instead. The master halted the file and jumped from his horse. He stormed and swore at this girl and said she had made annoyance enough with her laziness, and as this was the last chance he should have, he would settle the account now. She dropped on her knees and put up her hands and began to beg and cry and implore in a passion of terror, but the master gave no attention. He snatched the child from her, and then made the man-slaves who were chained before and behind her throw her on the ground and hold her there and expose her body, and then he laid on with his lash like a madman till her back was flayed, she shrieking and struggling the while piteously. One of the men who was holding her turned away his face, and for this humanity he was reviled and flogged. All our pilgrims looked on and commented on the expert way in which the whip was handled. They were too much hardened by lifelong everyday familiarity with slavery to notice that this was anything else in the exhibition that invited comment. This was what slavery could do, in the way of ossifying what one may call the superior lobe of human feeling. For these pilgrims were kind-hearted people, and they would not have allowed that man to treat a horse like that. I wanted to stop the whole thing and set the slaves free, but that would not do. I must not interfere too much and get myself a name for riding over the country's laws and the citizens' rights roughshod. If I lived and prospered, I would be the death of slavery. That I was resolved upon, but I would try to fix it so that when I became its executioner, it should be by command of the nation. Just here was the wayside shop of a smith, and now arrived a landed proprietor who had bought this girl a few miles back, deliverable here where her irons could be taken off. They were removed, then there was a squabble between the gentleman and the dealer as to who should play the blacksmith. The moment the girl was delivered from her irons, she flung herself, all tears and frantic sobbings, into the arms of the slave who had turned away his face when she was whipped. He strained her to his breast and smothered her face and the child's with kisses, and washed them with the rain of his tears. I suspected. I inquired. Yes, I was right. It was husband and wife. They had to be torn apart by force. The girl had to be dragged away, and she struggled and fought and shrieked like one gone mad till a turn of the road hid her from sight. And even after that, we could still make out the fading plaint of those receding shrieks. And the husband and father, with his wife and child gone, never to be seen by him again in life? Well, the look of him one might not bear at all, and so I turned away. But I knew I should never get his picture out of my mind again, and there it is to this day to wring my heartstrings whenever I think of it. We put up at the inn in a village just at nightfall, and when I rose next morning and looked abroad, I was where a knight came riding in the golden glory of the new day, and recognized him for knight of mine, Sir Ozana le Cure Hardy. He was in the gentleman's furnishing line, and his missionarying specialty was plug hats. He was clothed all in steel in the beautifulest armor of the time, up to where his helmet ought to have been, but he hadn't any helmet. He wore a shiny stovepipe hat, and was as ridiculous a spectacle as one might want to see. It was another of my surreptitious schemes for extinguishing knighthood by making it grotesque and absurd. Sir Ozana's saddle was hung about him with leather hat boxes, and every time he overcame a wandering knight, he swore him into my service and fitted him with a plug and made him wear it. I dressed and ran down to welcome Sir Ozana and get his news. How's trade? I asked. Ye will note that I have but these 4 left, yet there were 16 when else I got me from Camelot. Well, you've been certainly done nobly, Sir Ozana. What have you been foraging of late? I am but now come from the Valley of Holiness. Please you, sir. I am pointed for that place myself. Is there anything stirring in the monkery, more than common? By the mass, you may not question it. Give him good feed, boy, and stint it not, and thou valuest thy crown. So get ye lightly to the stable, and do even as I bid. Sir, it is parlous news I bring, and be these pilgrims? Then ye may not do better, good folk, than gather and heal the tale I have to tell, sith it concerneth you, for as much as ye go to find that ye will not find, and seek that ye will seek in vain, my life being hostage for my word, and my word and message being these, namely, that a hap has happened, whereof the like has not been seen no more but once this 200 years, which was the first and last time that this said misfortune strake the holy valley in that form by commandment of the Most High, whereunto by reasons just and causes thereunto contributing, wherein the matter, the miraculous font hath ceased to flow? This shout burst from 20 pilgrim mouths at once. Ye say well, good people, I was verging to it, even when you spake. Has somebody been washing again? Nay, it is suspected, but none believe it. It is thought to be some other sin, but none wit what. How are they feeling about the calamity? None may describe it in words. The fount is these 9 days dry. The prayers that did begin then, and the lamentations in sackcloth and ashes, and the holy processions, none of these have ceased, nor night, nor day, and so the monks and the nuns and the foundlings be all exhausted, and do hang up prayers writ upon parchment, sith that no strength is left in man to lift up voice. And at last they sent for thee, Sir Boss, to try magic and enchantment, and if you could not come, then there was the messenger to fetch Merlin, and he is there these 3 days now, and saith he will fetch that water though he burst the globe and wreck its kingdoms to accomplish it. And right bravely doth he work his magic and call upon his Hellions to hie them hither and help, but not a whiff of moisture hath he started yet, even so much as might qualify as mist upon a copper mirror, and ye count not the sweat, thereof sweat he sweateth betwixt sun and sun over the dire labours of his task, and if ye, breakfast was ready. As soon as it was over, I showed to Sir Ozana the words which I had written on the inside of his hat: Chemical Department, Laboratory Extension, Section G, please spend PXXP, send 2 of first size, 2 of number 3, and 6 of number 4, together with the proper complementary details, and 2 of my trained assistants. And I said, now get you to Camelot as fast as you can fly, brave knight, and show the writing to Clarence, and tell him to have these required matters in the Valley of Holiness with all possible dispatch. "I will well, Sir Boss." And he was off. Chapter 22. The Holy Fountain. The pilgrims were human beings. Otherwise they would have acted differently. They had come a long and difficult journey, and now when the journey was nearly finished, and they learned that the main thing they had come for had ceased to exist, they didn't do as horses or cats or angleworms would probably have done, turn back and get at something profitable. No, anxious as they had been before to see the miraculous fountain, they were as much as 40 times as anxious now to see the place where it used to be. There's no counting for human beings. We made good time, and a couple of hours before sunset we stood upon the high confines of the Valley of Holiness, and our eyes swept it from end to end and noted its features. That is, its large features. These were the three masses of buildings. They were distant and isolated temporalities shrunken to toy constructions in the lonely waste of what seemed a desert, and was. Such a scene is always mournful, for it is so impressively still and looks so steeped in death. But there was a sound here which interrupted the stillness only to add to its mournfulness. This was the faint, far sound of tolling bells which floated fitfully to us on the passing breeze, and so faintly, so softly, that we hardly knew whether we heard it with our ears or with our spirits. We reached the monastery before dark, and there the males were given lodging, but the women were sent over to the nunnery. The bells were close at hand now, and their solemn booming smote upon the ear like a message of doom. A superstitious despair possessed the heart of every monk and published itself in his ghastly face. Everywhere these black-robed, soft-sandaled, tallow-visaged spectres appeared, flitted about and disappeared, noiseless as the creatures of a troubled dream, and as uncanny. The old abbot's joy to see me was pathetic, even to tears, and he did the shedding himself. He said, "Delay not, son, but get to thy saving work, and we bring not the water back again, and soon we are ruined, and the good work of 200 years must end, and see thou do it with enchantments that be holy, for the church will not endure that work in her cause be done by devil's magic. When I work, Father, be sure that there will be no devil's work connected to it. I shall use no arts that come of the devil, and no elements not created by the hand of God, but is Merlin working strictly on pious lines. Ah, he said he would, my son, he said he would, and took oath to make his promise good. Well, in that case, let him proceed. But surely you will not sit idle by, but help. It will not answer to mix methods, Father, neither would it be professional courtesy. Two of a trade must not undercut each other. We might as well cut rates and be done with it. It would arrive at that in the end. Merlin has the contract. No other magician can touch him till he throws it up. But I will take from him. It is a terrible emergency, and the act is thereby justified. And if it were not so, what will give law to the church? The church giveth law to all, and what she wills to do, that she may do, hurt whom it may. I will take it from him. You may begin upon the moment. It may not be, Father. No doubt, as you say, where power is supreme, one can do as one likes and suffer no injury, but we poor magicians are not so situated. Merlin is a very good magician, in a small way, and has a quite a neat provincial reputation. He's struggling along, doing the best he can, and it would not be etiquette for me to take his job until he himself abandons it. The abbot's face lighted. Ah, that is simple. There are ways to persuade him to abandon it. No, Father, it skills not, as these people say. If he were persuaded against his will, he would load that well with a malicious enchantment which would balk me till I found out its secret. It might take a month. I could set up a little enchantment of mine, which I call the telephone, and he could not find out its secret in 100 years. Yet, you perceive, he might block me for a month. Would you like to risk a month in a dry time like this? A month? The mere thought of it maketh me to shudder. Have it thy way, my son, but my heart is heavy with this disappointment. Leave me. Let me wear my spirit with weariness and waiting, even as I have done these 10 long days, counterfeiting thus this thing that is called rest, the prone body making outward sign of repose when inwardly is none. Of course, it would have been best all around for Merlin to waive etiquette and quit and call it half a day, since he would never be able to start that water, for he was a true magician of the time, which is to say the big miracles, the ones that gave him his reputation, always had the luck to be performed when nobody but Merlin was present. He couldn't start this well with all this crowd around to see. A crowd was as bad for a magician's miracle in that day as it was for a spiritualist's miracle in mine. There was sure to be some skeptic on hand to turn up the gas at the crucial moment and spoil everything. But I did not want Merlin to retire from the job until I was ready to take hold of it effectively myself, and I could not do that till I got my things from Camelot, and that would take 2 or 3 days. My presence gave the monks hope and cheered them up a good deal, insomuch they ate a square meal that night for the first time in 10 days. As soon as their stomachs had been properly reinforced with food, their spirits began to rise fast. When the mead began to go round, they rose faster. By the time everybody was half seas over, the whole community was in good shape to make a night of it, so we stayed by the board and put it through on that line. Matters got to be very jolly. Good old questionable stories were told that made the tears run down and cavernous mouths stand wide and the round bellies shake with laughter, and questionable songs were bellowed out in a mighty chorus that drowned the boom of the tolling bells. At last I ventured a story myself, and vast was the success of it. Not right off, of course, for the native of those islands does not as a rule dissolve upon the early applications of a humorous thing, but the 5th time I told it, they began to crack in places. The 8th time I told it, they began to crumble. At the 12th repetition, they fell apart in chunks, and at the 15th, they disintegrated, and I got a broom and swept them up. This language is figurative. These islanders, well, they're slow pay at first in the matter of return for your investment of effort, but in the end, they make the pay of all other nations poor and small by contrast. I was at the well next day betimes. Merlin was there, enchanting away like a beaver, but not raising the moisture. He was not in a pleasant humor, and every time I hinted that perhaps this contract was a shade too hefty for a novice, he unlimbered his tongue and cursed like a bishop. French bishop of the Regency days, I mean. Matters were about as I expected to find them. The fountain was an ordinary well. It had been dug in the ordinary way and stoned up in the ordinary way. There's no miracle about it. Even the lie that had created its reputation was not miraculous. I could have told it myself with one hand tied behind me. The well was in a dark chamber which stood in the center of a cut-stone chapel, whose walls were hung with pious pictures of a workmanship that would have made a chromo feel good. Pictures historically commemorative of curative miracles which had been achieved by the waters when nobody was looking. That is, nobody but angels. They are always on deck when there is a miracle to the fore, so as to get put in the picture, perhaps. Angels are as fond of that as a fire company. Look at the old masters. The well chamber was dimly lighted by lamps. The water was drawn with a windlass and chain by monks, and poured into troughs which delivered it into stone reservoirs outside in the chapel. When there was water to draw, I mean, and none but monks could enter the well chamber. I entered it because I had temporary authority to do so, by courtesy of my professional brother and subordinate. But he hadn't entered it himself. He did everything by incantations. He never worked his intellect. If he had stepped in there and used his eyes, instead of his disordered mind, he could have cured the well by natural means and then turned it into a miracle in the customary way. But no, he was an old numbskull, a magician who believed in his own magic. And no magician can thrive who is handicapped with a superstition like that. I had an idea that the well had sprung a leak, that some of the wall stones near the bottom had fallen and exposed fissures that allowed the water to escape. I measured the chain, 98 feet. Then I called in a couple of monks, locked the door, took a candle, and made them lower me in the bucket. When the chain was all paid out, the candle confirmed my suspicion. A considerable section of the wall was gone, exposing a good big fissure. I almost regretted that my theory about the well's trouble was correct, because I had another one that had a showy point or two about it for a miracle. I remembered that in America, many centuries later, when an oil well ceased to flow, they used to blast it out with a dynamite torpedo. If I should find this well dry and no explanation of it, I could astonish these people most nobly by having a person of no especial value drop a dynamite bomb into it. It was my idea to appoint Merlin. However, it was plain that there was no occasion for the bomb. One cannot have everything the way he would like it. A man has no business to be depressed by disappointment. Anyway, he ought to make up his mind to get even. This is what I did. I said to myself, I am no hurry. I can wait. That bomb will come good yet, and it did too. When I was above ground again, I turned out the monks and let down a fish line. The well was 150 feet deep, and there was 41 feet of water in it. I called in a monk and asked, How deep is the well? That, sir, I wit not, having never been told. How does the water usually stand in it? Near to the top these 2 centuries, as the testimony goeth, brought down to us through our predecessors. It was true, as to recent times at least, for there was witnesses to it, and better witness than a monk. Only about 20 or 30 feet of the chain showed wear and use. The rest of it was unworn and rusty. What had happened when the well gave out that other time? Without doubt, some practical person had come along and mended the leak, and then had come up and told the abbot he had discovered by divination that if the sinful bath were destroyed, the well would flow again. The leak had befallen again now, and these children would have prayed and processioned and tolled their bells for heavenly succor till they all dried up and blew away, and no innocent of them would have ever thought to drop a fish line into the well or go down and try to find out what was really the matter. Old habit of mind is one of the toughest things to get away from in the world. It transmits itself like physical form and feature, and for a man, in those days, to have had an idea that his ancestors hadn't had, would have brought him under suspicion of being illegitimate. I said to the monk, "It's a difficult miracle to restore water in a dry well, but we will try if my brother Merlin fails. Brother Merlin is a very passable artist, but only in the parlor magic line, and he may not succeed. In fact, is not likely to succeed. But there should be nothing to his credit. The man that can do this kind of miracle knows enough to keep hotel." Hotel? I mind not to have heard of hotel. It's what you call hostel. The man that can do this miracle can keep hostel. I can do this miracle. I shall do this miracle. Yet I do not try to conceal from you that it is a miracle, to tax the occult powers to the last strain. None knoweth the truth better than the brotherhood, indeed, for it is of record that aforetime it was parlous difficult and took a year. Natheless, God send you good success, and in that end we will pray. As a matter of business, it was a good idea to get the notion around that the thing was difficult. Many a small thing has been made large by the right kind of advertising. That monk was filled up with the difficulty of this enterprise. He would fill up the others. In 2 days, the solicitude would be booming. On my way home at noon, I met Sandy. She had been sampling the hermits. I said, "I would like to do that myself. This is Wednesday. Is there a matinee?" "A which, please, you said?" "Matinee. Do they keep open afternoons?" "Who?" "The hermits, of course." "Keep open?" "Yes, keep open. Isn't that plain enough? Do they knock off at noon?" "Knock off?" "Knock off. Yes, knock off. What's the matter with knock off? I never saw such a dunderhead. Can't you understand anything at all? In plain terms, do they shut up shop, draw the game, bank the fires? Shut up shop, draw... There, never mind. Let it go. Let it go. You make me tired. You can't seem to understand the simplest thing." "I would I might please thee, sir, and it is to me dole and sorrow that I fail, albeit sith I am but a simple damsel, and taught of none, being from the cradle unbaptized in those deep waters of learning, that do anoint with sovereignty him that partaketh of that most noble sacrament, investing him with reverend state to the mental eye of the humble mortal, who, by bar and lack of that great consecration, seeth in his own unlearned estate but a symbol of that other sort of lack and loss which men do publish in the pit to the pitying eye with sackcloth strappings, whereupon the ashes of grief do lie bepowdered and bestrewn, and so when such in the darkness of his mind encounter these golden phrases of high mystery, these shut up shops, and draw the game, and bank the fires, it is but by the grace of God that he bursts not for envy of the mind that can beget, and tongue that can deliver so great and mellow-sounding miracles of speech. And if there do ensue confusion in that humbler mind, and failure to divine the meanings of these wonders, then if so be this miscomprehension is not vain, but sooth and true, wit ye well it is the very substance of worshipful dear homage, and may not lightly be misprized, nor had been, and ye had noted this complexion of my mood and mind, and understood that I would, I could not, and I could not, I might not, nor yet, nor might, nor could, nor might not, nor could not, might be by advantage, turned by the desired would. And so I pray you mercy of my fault, and that ye will of your kindness and your charity forgive it, good my master and good dear lord." I couldn't make it all out, that is the details, but I got the general idea, and enough of it too to be ashamed. It was not fair to spring these 19th century technicalities upon the untutored infant of the 6th and then rail at her because she couldn't get their drift. And when she was making the honest best drive that she could, too, and no fault of hers that she couldn't fetch the home plate, so I apologized. Then we meandered pleasantly away toward the hermit holes and sociable converse together, and better friends than ever. I was gradually coming to have a mysterious and shuddery reverence for this girl, for nowadays, whenever she pulled out from the station and got her train fairly started on one of those horizonless transcontinental sentences of hers, it was borne in upon me that I was standing in the awful presence of the mother of the German language. I was so impressed with this that sometimes when she began to empty one of those sentences upon me, I unconsciously took the very attitude of reverence and stood uncovered. And if words had been water, I had been drowned, sure. She had exactly the German way. Whatever was in her mind to be delivered, whether a mere remark or a sermon or an encyclopedia or the history of a war, she would get it into a single sentence or die. Whenever the literary German dives into a sentence, that is the last you are going to see of him until he emerges on the other side of the Atlantic with his verb in his mouth. We drifted from hermit to hermit all the afternoon. It was a most strange menagerie. The chief emulation among them seemed to be to see who could manage to be the uncleanest and most prosperous with vermin. Their manner and attitudes were the last expression of complacent self-righteousness. It was one anchorite's pride to lie naked in the mud and let the insects bite him and blister him unmolested. It was another's to lean against a rock, all day long, conspicuous to the admiration of the throng of pilgrims, and pray. It was another's to go naked and crawl around on all fours. It was another's to drag about with him, year in and year out, 80 pounds of iron. It was another's to never lie down when he slept, but to stand among the thorn bushes and snore when there were pilgrims around to look. A woman who had the white hair of age and no other apparel was black from head, crown to heel with 47 years of holy abstinence from water. Groups of gazing pilgrims stood around all and every of these strange objects, lost in reverent wonder and envious of the fleckless sanctity which these pious austerities had won for them from an exacting heaven. By and by we went to see one of the supremely great ones. He was a mighty celebrity. His fame had penetrated all Christendom. The noble and the renowned journeyed from the remotest lands on the globe to pay him reverence. His stand was in the center of the wildest part of the valley, and it took all that space to hold his crowds. His stand was a pillar 60 feet high with a broad platform on the top of it. He was now doing what he had been doing every day for 20 years up there, bowing his body ceaselessly and rapidly almost to his feet. It was his way of praying. I timed him with a stopwatch, and he made 1,244 revolutions in 24 minutes and 46 seconds. It seemed to have pity to have all this power going to waste. It was one of the most useful motions in mechanics, the pedal movement. So I made a note in my memorandum book proposing someday to apply a system of elastic cords to him and run a sewing machine with it. I afterwards carried out that scheme and got 5 years' good service out of him, in which time he turned out upwards of 18,000 first-rate tow linen shirts, which was 10 a day. I worked him Sundays and all. He was going. Sundays, the same as weekdays, and it was no use to waste the power. These shirts cost me nothing but just the mere trifle for the materials. I furnished those myself. It would not have been right to make him do that, and they sold like smoke to pilgrims at $1.50 apiece, which was the price of 50 cows or a blooded racehorse in Arthurdom. They were regarded as a perfect protection against sin, and advertised as such by my knights everywhere, with the paint pot and stencil plate, insomuch that there was not a cliff or a boulder or a dead wall in England, but you could read on it at a mile distance, "By the only genuine Saint Stylite, patronized by the nobility, patent applied for." There was more money in the business than one knew what to do with. As it extended, I brought out a line of goods suitable for kings, and a knobby thing for duchesses and that sort, with ruffles down the forehatch and the running gear clewed up with a feather stitch to leeward and hauled aft with a backstay and triced up with a half-turn and the standing rigging forward of the weather gaskets. Yes, it was a daisy. But about that time I noticed that the motive power had taken to standing on one leg, and I also found that there was something the matter with the other one, and so I stocked the business and unloaded, taking Sir Bors de Ganis into camp financially along with certain of his friends, for the work stopped within a year, and the good saint got him to his rest. But he had earned it, and say that for him. When I saw him that first time, however, his personal condition will not quite bear description here. You can read it in the Lives of the Saints. Chapter 23. Restoration of the Fountain. Saturday noon I went to the well and looked on a while. Merlin was still burning smoke powders and pawing the air and mubbering gibberish as hard as ever, but looking pretty downhearted. For of course he had not even started even a perspiration in that well yet. Finally I said, "How does the thing promise by this time, partner?" "Behold, I am even now busied with trial of the powerfulest enchantment known to the princes of the occult arts in the lands of the East, and it fail me not can avail. Peace, till I finish." He raised a smoke this time that darkened all the region and must have made matters uncomfortable for the hermits, for the wind was their way, and it rolled down over their dens in a dense and billowy fog. He pawed out volumes of speech to match, and contorted his body and sawed the air with his hands in a most extraordinary way. At the end of 20 minutes he dropped down panting and about exhausted. Now arrived the abbot and several hundred monks and nuns, and behind them a multitude of pilgrims and a couple of acres of foundlings, all drawn by the prodigious smoke, and all in a grand state of excitement. The abbot inquired anxiously for results. Merlin said, "If any labor of mortal might break the spell that binds these waters, this which I have but just essayed had done it. It has failed, whereby I do not now know that which I had feared is a truth established. The sign of this failure is that the most potent spirit known to the magicians of the East, and whose name none may utter and live, has laid his spell upon this well. The mortal does not breathe, nor ever will, who can penetrate the secret of that spell, and without that secret none can break it. The water will flow no more, forever, good father. I have done what man could. Suffer me to go." Of course, this threw the abbot into a good deal of consternation. He turned to me with the signs of it in his face and said, "Ye have heard him, is it true?" "Part of it is." "Not all, then, not all. What part is true?" "That the spirit with the Russian name has put his spell upon the well." "God's wounds, are we then we ruined?" "Possibly, but not certainly." "You mean not certainly?" "That is it." "Wherefore ye also mean that when he saith none can break the spell." "Yes, when he says that, he says what isn't necessarily true. There are conditions under which an effort to break it may have some chance. That is, some small, some trifling chance of success." "The conditions? Oh, they are nothing difficult, only these. I want the well and the surroundings for the space of half a mile entirely to myself from sunset to day until I remove the ban, and nobody allowed to cross the ground but by my authority." "Are these all?" "Yes." "And you have no fear to try?" "Oh, none. One may fail, of course. One may also succeed. One can try, and I'm ready to chance it. I have my conditions. These and all others ye may name. I will issue commandment to that effect." "Wait," said Merlin with an evil smile. "Ye wit that he who would break this spell must know that spirit's name?" "Yes, I know his name." "In which ye also that to know it skills not of itself, but ye must likewise pronounce it." "Ha ha, knew ye that?" "Yes, I knew that too." "You had that knowledge. Art a fool? Are ye minded to utter that name and die?" "Utter it? Why, certainly I would utter it if it was Welsh." "Ye are even a dead man then, and I go to tell Arthur." "That's all right. Take your gripsack, get along. The thing for you to do is go home and work the weather, John W. Merlin." It was a home shot, and it made him wince, for he was the worst weather failure in the kingdom. Whenever he ordered up the danger signals along the coast, there was a week's dead calm ashore, and every time he prophesied fair weather, it rained brickbats. And I kept in the Weather Bureau right along to undermine his reputation. However, that shot raised his bile, and instead of starting home to report my death, he said he would remain and enjoy it. My two experts arrived in the evening, and pretty well fagged, for they had traveled double tides. They had pack mules along and had brought everything I needed: tools, pump, lead pipe, Greek fire, sheaves of big rockets, Roman candles, colored fire sprays, electric apparatus, and a lot of sundries, everything necessary for the stateliest kind of a miracle. They got their supper and a nap, and about midnight we sallied out through a solitude so wholly vacant and complete that it quite overpassed the required conditions. We took possession of the well and its surroundings. My boys were experts in all sorts of things, from the stoning up of a well to the constructing of a mathematical instrument. An hour before sunrise, we had that leak mended in ship-shape fashion, and the water began to rise. Then we stowed our fireworks in the chapel, locked up the place, and went home to bed. Before the new mass was over, we were at the well again, for there was a good deal to do yet, and I was determined to spring the miracle before midnight, for business reasons. For whereas a miracle worked for the church on a weekday is worth a good deal, it is worth 6 times as much as if you get it on a Sunday. In 9 hours, the water had risen to its customary level. That is to say, it was within 23 feet of the top. We put in a little iron pump, one of the first turned out by my works near the Capitol. We bored into a stone reservoir which stood against the outer wall of the well chamber, and inserted a section of lead pipe that was long enough to reach the door of the chapel and project beyond the threshold, where the gushing water would be visible to the 250 acres of people I was intending should be present on the flat plain in front of this little holy hillock, at the proper time. We knocked the head out of an empty hogshead and hoisted this hogshead to the flat roof of the chapel, where we clamped it down fast, poured in gunpowder till it lay loosely an inch deep on the bottom. Then we stood up rockets in the hogshead as thick as they could loosely stand. All the different breeds of rockets there are, and they made a portly, imposing sheaf, I can tell you. We grounded the wire of a pocket electrical battery in that powder. We placed a whole magazine of Greek fire on each corner of the roof, blue on one corner, green on another, red on another, and purple on the last, and grounded a wire in each. About 200 yards off in the flat, we built a pen of scantlings, about 4 feet high, and laid planks on it, and so made a platform. We covered it with swell tapestries borrowed for the occasion, and topped it off with the abbot's own throne. When you are going to do a miracle for an ignorant race, you want to get in every detail that will count. You want to make all the properties impressive to the public eye. You want to make matters comfortable for your head guest. Then you can turn yourself loose and play your effects for all they are worth. I know the value of these things, for I know human nature. You can't throw too much style into a miracle. It costs trouble and work, and sometimes money, but it pays in the end. Well, we brought the wires to the ground at the chapel and then brought them under the ground to the platform and hid the batteries there. We put a rope fence 100 feet square around the platform to keep off common multitude, and that finished the work. My idea was doors open at 10:30, performance begin at 11:25 sharp. I wished I could charge admission, but of course that wouldn't answer. I instructed my boys to be in the chapel as early as 10, before anybody was around, and make ready to man the pumps at the proper time and make the fur fly. Then we went home to supper. The news of the disaster to the well had traveled far by this time, and now for 2 or 3 days a steady avalanche of people had been pouring into the valley. The lower end of the valley was become one huge camp. We should have a good house, no question about that. Criers went the rounds early in the evening and announced the coming attempt, which put every pulse up to fever heat. They gave notice that the abbot and his official suite would move in state and occupy the platform at 10:30, up to which time all the region which was under my ban must be clear. Bells would then cease from tolling, and the sign should be permission to the multitudes to close in and take their places. I was at the platform and all ready to do the honors when the abbot's solemn procession hove in sight, which it did not do till it was nearly to the rope fence, because it was a starless black night and no torches permitted. With it came Merlin and took a front seat on the platform. He was as good as his word for once. One could not see the multitudes banked together beyond the band, but they were there, just the same. The moment the bells stopped, those banked masses broke and poured over the line like a vast black wave. And for as much as a half hour it continued to flow, and then it solidified itself, and you could have walked upon a pavement of human heads to, well, miles. We had a solemn stage wait now for about 20 minutes, a thing I had counted on for effect. It is always good to let your audience have a chance to work up its expectancy. At length, out of the silence, a noble Latin chant, men's voices broke and swelled up and rolled away into the night, a majestic tide of melody. I put that up too, and it was one of the best effects I had ever invented. When it was finished, I stood up on the platform and extended my hands abroad for 2 minutes, with my face uplifted. That always produces a dead hush. And then slowly pronounced this ghastly word with a kind of awfulness which caused hundreds to tremble and many women to faint. Constantinople, Stanischer, Ruben, Sack, Pfeifen, Mascher, Gelstadt, Schaft. Just as I was moaning out the closing hunks of that word, I touched off one of my electric connections, and all that murky world of people stood revealed in a hideous blue glare. It was immense, that effect. Lots of people shrieked, women curled up and quit in every direction, foundlings collapsed by platoons. The abbots and the monks crossed themselves nimbly, and their lips fluttered with agitated prayers. Merlin held his grip, but he was astonished clear down to his corns. He had never seen anything to begin with like that before. Now was the time to pile in the effects. I lifted my hands and groaned out the word as if it were an angry. Nihilus dynamiten heater cashen spring guns attention der Bergen Schrugen, and turned on the red fire. You should have heard that Atlantic of people moan and howl when the crimson hell joined the blue. After 60 seconds, I shouted, Transbald Trumpen, Penton Transport, Trommel, Tremor, Tremor, Trongen, Thremen, Traudrubi, and lit up the green fire. After waiting only 40 seconds, this time I spread my arms abroad and thundered out the devastating syllables of this word of word. Mecca Muso Mannen Massen Menschen Marder Morhen Mutter Mar More Monumental Masher, and whirled on the purple glare. There they were, all going at once, red, blue, green, purple, 4 furious volcanoes pouring vast clouds of radiant smoke aloft, and spreading a blinding rainbowed noonday to the furthest confines of that valley. In the distance, one could see the fellow on the pillar standing rigid against the background of sky, his seesawed stop for the first time in 20 years. I knew the boys were at the pump now and ready. So I said to the abbot, "The time has come, Father. I'm about to pronounce the dread name and command the spell to dissolve. You want to brace up and take hold of something." Then I shouted to the people, "Behold, in another minute the spell will be broken, or no mortal can break it. If it break, all will know it, for you will see the sacred water gush from the chapel floor." I stood a few moments to let the hearers have a chance to spread my announcements to those who couldn't hear, and so convey it to the furthest ranks. Then I made a grand exhibition of extra posturing and gesturing and shouted, "Lo! I command the fell spirit that possesses the holy fountain to now disgorge into the skies all the infernal fires that still remain in him, and straightway dissolve his spell, and hence flee hence to the pit, there to lie bound 1,000 years. By his own dread name I commanded, Biji Wetra Rek Roch!" And I touched off the hogshead of rockets, and a vast fountain of dazzling lances of fire vomited itself toward the zenith with a rushing hiss, and burst in mid-sky into a storm of flashing jewels. One mighty groan of terror started up from the massed people, then suddenly broke into a wild hosanna of joy, for there, fair and plain in the uncanny glare, they saw the freed water leaping forth. The old abbot could not speak a word for tears and the chokings in his throat. Without utterance of any sort, he folded me in his arms and mashed me. It was more eloquent than speech, and harder to get over, too, in a country where there were really no doctors that were worth a damaged nickel. You should have seen those acres of people throw themselves down in that water and kiss it and pet it and fondle it and talk to it as if it were alive, and welcome it back with the dear names they gave their darlings, just as if it had been a friend who was long gone away and lost, and was to come home again. Yes, it was pretty to see, and made me think more of them than I had done before. I sent Merlin home on a shudder. He had caved in and gone down like a landslide when I pronounced that fearful name, and had never come to since. He had never had heard that name before, neither had I, but to him it was the right one, any jumble would have been the right one. He admitted afterward that spirit's own mother could not have pronounced that name better than I did. He never could understand how I survived it, and I didn't tell him. There's only young magicians that give away a secret like that. Merlin spent 3 months working enchantments to try to find out the deep trick of how to pronounce that name and outlive it. But he didn't arrive. When I started to the chapel, the populace uncovered and fell back reverently to make a wide way for me, as if I had been some kind of a superior being. And I was. I was aware of that. I took along a night shift of monks and taught them the mystery of the pump, and set them to work, for it was plain that a good part of the people out there were going to sit up with the water all night. Consequently, it was but right that they should have all they wanted of it. To those monks, that pump was a good deal of a miracle itself, and they were full of wonder over it, and of admiration, too, of the exceeding effectiveness in its performance. It was a great night, an immense night. There was reputation in it. I could hardly get to sleep for glorying over it. And that is where I shall leave you for this week. I hope everyone enjoyed all the troubles and tribulations and adventures that Hank has as he struggles to be a modern man in the time of King Arthur's court. So, that ends our chapters for tonight. Our next session will be in 2 weeks on Thursday, May the 26th at 7 p.m. right here on YouTube. In the meantime, keep wearing your fantastic wizard's hats. Keep creating your own wizard names. Keep watch all of our past episodes, all of our OG animated episodes. You can even watch the ones for our last book. And I will see you in 2 weeks' time on Thursday, May the 26th at 7 p.m. right here on YouTube. Bye.